tweets from U.S. President Donald Trump on U.S. China trade war negotiations create confusion and a sell-off on Wall Street. Plus, the immigration crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border and the fate of thousands of people seeking asylum in the United States. And we'll remember the late U.S. President George H.W. Bush, his legacy and outreach to China. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Both sides call it progress towards easing the trade war, but we're seeing different messages from China and the United States about what exactly was agreed to when their teams, led by Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and Donald Trump, the American president, when they sat down to work out that truce over the weekend in Buenos Aires. Both sides agreed to hold off new tariffs, and President Xi pledged to increase Chinese purchases of American products. Later, President Trump said China committed to buying large amounts of U.S. agricultural products and reducing and removing tariffs on U.S. automobiles, but Beijing has yet to confirm those details. News of the trade truce sent stocks higher on Monday, but continued confusion about the agreement turned those gains around on Tuesday. Wall Street saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average drop nearly 800 points. Well, let's bring in our panel to talk about all of this. Joining us now in the studio is Eleanor Clift. She's a political analyst with the Daily Beast. Also with us is Simon Marks. He's the president and chief correspondent of Feature Story News. From Beijing, Zhao Hai is a research fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. From Houston, Texas, Tony Payne is the director of the Mexico Center at the Baker Institute at Rice University. And John Sitilides is a global risk analyst and principal with Trilogy Advisors right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Zhao Hai, let me start with you in China. And of course, we've been talking about the talks that took place in Buenos Aires between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. There was some relief. We heard of a truce in this trade dispute between the two countries. Now, after what seems like a series of confusing tweets, prospects for a deal seem to have fallen apart. As we just reported, there's been some consequence here in the United States. The Dow Jones Index on the New York Stock Exchange dropped almost 800 points. So what is the view from China? What does China think of all of this?
Well, I think number one, there are some facts we have to confirm. There has been a truce between U.S. and China because the U.S. side has promised not to raise tariff on January 1st next year. And secondly, I think there has been a compromise between two sides, and they have been talking about many areas in which they can negotiate. But the details has yet to come out. Both sides have different interpretations of the agreement during that meeting. So I think we still have to wait for the negotiation team to meet with each other and then get out what exactly they have been agreed upon. I think during that very short period of time, altogether no more than 3 hours, it's very hard to get out a very concrete deal between the two sides. The important thing at this point is that two leaders, top leaders of both countries, agreed to set out a new tone between the two countries. That is that they need to coordinate, cooperate, and maintain the stability of relations between the two countries. I think that's the key point. And moving forward, because both presidents has promised to keep a friendship between the two countries and keep a negotiation ongoing, so we can expect, I think, a real deal after 90 days, even though some of the most difficult items may not have a final result by the end of 90 days. But I think a framework of agreement can come out, can emerge by the end of this date.
John, do you share that optimism? Because, you know, as Zhao Hai just told us, there are differing interpretations of what came out of that meeting in Buenos Aires, which, as we see, is causing this blowback here in the United States.
I don't know if I can declare optimism yet. Once the negotiating teams come together, I think we'll have a clearer sense as to what the pathway forward looks like. I think one of the things that roiled the markets today was the confirmation that Robert Lighthizer is going to be the lead trade negotiator for the Trump team. It's not going to be Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. I think there are many who are concerned that because he's going to take a much tougher line on China than any of the other potential negotiators might have taken. I think people are concerned that they won't be able to hammer out a solid framework for agreement within the next 90 days. So I think that's going to be the major issue. But once the negotiating teams are underway, we'll see whether or not we really have an amicable framework for these talks, whether or not it's going to be very, very difficult to do anything in the next 90 days or beyond.
Simon, there's something else, and that is there a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of the president on what tariffs are and what they do?
Well, he described himself on Twitter today as a tariff man, so one would think that he is articulate on this particular issue. But, you know, this has become the tale not just of two interpretations of what went on in Argentina, the Chinese interpretation and President Trump's interpretation. There are multiple interpretations within the Trump camp itself about what happened in Argentina. So how you get from here to a successful negotiation 90 days out when there doesn't even seem to be agreement about whether the Chinese struck a deal with the United States in Argentina over automobiles, whether there was even an agreement on that particular 90-day clock and when it started to run. I think those are all open questions. What we can say without any risk of contradiction is that Donald Trump doesn't do nuance very well. The Chinese are all about nuance in their response to this, and now it's going to be up to Robert Lighthizer and his team, which we learned today will include Peter Navarro, someone who is very problematic from the Chinese side, to try and communicate nuance while the president is sitting there blindly tweeting away and impacting, as we saw today, the financial markets.
That's right, Eleanor, isn't it? We continue to see this policy by tweet on the part of Donald Trump, which results in this confusion that we see on Wall Street and the markets taking a battering. Who is advising him and who is telling him what this means and what he says has consequences?
Well, he's getting two different strains of advice. He's getting advice from the Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mnuchin, to basically back off and go slow and don't get into a trade war. And then he's getting advice from the hardliners that have now been appointed as the negotiators, you know, saying that keep pushing. We've got China over barrel here. You're winning, Mr. President. And the president seems to think that when United States collects tariffs, that's like money passing from China into the U.S. Treasury. He doesn't really see it as a tax on the American people. And so he views any kind of lopsided trade arrangement, if we're importing more than we're exporting, that's somehow a losing situation, when it's, as he pointed out, it's much more subtle than that. And so, but the president, I think he was moved to go ahead with President Xi and forge this truce because he was seeing a backlash in the stock market, and now there's an even bigger backlash in the stock market because they see through this truce to be a 90-day period during which it's hard to see how they're going to accomplish everything this president wants. He wants intellectual rights as to be part of the deal. He's not just doing it about tariffs on a handful of products. He's got a broad agenda here. And to pull that off in 90 days, very difficult.
Okay, John, I will get to you in a moment, but I want to get the response of Zhao Hai. Zhao Hai, what is your response to what you've heard here in Washington? The panelists here don't seem to share your optimism that there could be a comprehensive deal in 90 days.
Well, I have a different take on this. Number one, I think putting Lighthizer as the head negotiator with China is not necessarily a bad thing, because we have been going in rounds of negotiations before, and you have Secretary Ross and Secretary Mnuchin been talking with China, but there's no outcome. China needs the U.S. to make up its mind and have a leader in terms of negotiations so that we can go into real negotiations and have a real agreement. And the other thing is that the real negotiator, the final decider here, is President Trump. So whatever hotliner or dovish people in his team, it doesn't matter. What matters is what the President Trump decide how to move forward. So I think in this respect, after President Xi and President Trump reach agreement that these two countries should negotiate and have a final settlement on the trade issue, that is the critical thing to think about instead of just consider who's the leading negotiator. Okay. And the other thing is that when China and U.S. go into real negotiations, of course, the market understands there are hard issues here at stake. However, I think the most important thing, and also the American side explained, once you settle, the real progress has been made, then other things can be, phased out, can have a stage negotiations following that 90 days. We don't have to necessarily settle everything within the 90 days. When President Trump and President Xi satisfied with the first stage negotiations, they can, of course, have a second and third stage.
Okay, John, go ahead.
Yeah, two quick points. One, in terms of the president's tweets, beyond what he may be putting out himself, the two negotiating teams themselves couldn't even agree on the readouts. So in terms of the formal White House communications and those from the Communist Party regarding the outcome of the talks, 142 items that the Trump administration is looking to negotiate on, they couldn't agree as to the readouts that were distributed to the press over the weekend. So a major problem just in deciding what is the framework, what's the basis for talks going forward. And secondly, when you talk about who's influencing the president, I want to be sure that we're not compartmentalizing trade outside the largest strategic framework through which the U.S. is viewing this relationship with China. You have people like Michael Pillsbury at the Hudson Institute, who, in addition to Lighthizer as a trade hawk, is a strategic hawk on China. He's got the president's ear. My sense is Trump is putting all of this together into one grand equation to the extent he's able to.
All right, let me bring in Tony Pan. He's in Houston. And Tony, there was one other trade agreement that was discussed. Well, it wasn't discussed. There was the signing of a trade agreement, the revamped NAFTA agreement, now known as the USMCA. The big question, of course, is whether the three countries involved, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, whether the legislatures in those countries will ratify that deal. Mexico has a new president. What's the sentiment like in Mexico on this new NAFTA, or the USMCA as it's known? Because I know that Canada was not very happy. Canada felt that its arm was being twisted.
Well, obviously, I think the sign of optimism here is key, and that has to do with Lighthizer, who's now going to China. But we know that Mr. Trump was fixated practically on a couple of issues: wages in Mexico, dairy in Canada, and the North American content, really American content for automobiles. And I think in the end, Mr. Lighthizer turned out a very good product. I think the USMCA really deepens and broadens NAFTA, which needed modernization, and I think the USMCA does it. So in the end, I think Mr. Trump's lack of understanding for nuances is made up by Mr. Lighthizer's competency in negotiating these trade deals. So that's a good thing that he is going to China, and he's going to be able to understand this well beyond what Mr. Trump wants, and then deliver specific things that Mr. Trump is fixated on, get some concessions from the Chinese, and declare victory. I'm not sure they can do this by March, however. I mean, the North American Free Trade Agreement was supposed to be negotiated in 6 months, and it took about 14 months to do. So they're painted into a corner, but they may be able to declare some victory by March and then have additional negotiations past that.
Right. Eleanor, one quick question on the trade issue before I move on to the next subject, and that is there any role for the U.S. Congress in this?
Oh, yes. The trade agreement has to be ratified by the Congress. And the Democrats are putting up obstacles. They would like better protection for workers from Mexico in particular. So the president does not have the votes today. Now, whether he's going to be willing to do the lobbying, whether they can even open up that agreement to make any changes to get the votes, that's problematic. So this is not a done deal.
That's on the USMCA, but what about the negotiations with China? Can Congress make its voice heard?
I'm sure Congress will have its words somehow, but I'm not sure that that's something that the president has to get a vote in Congress unless there's a real treaty.
Right,
I mean, this is sort of a back and forth about tariffs, and the president seems to have that ability to do that on his own.
Okay, I want to go back to Tony for the next issue we want to talk about. And Tony, that's about immigration. That's about what's going on the U.S.-Mexico border. Thousands of asylum seekers there trying to get into the United States. Some now have even tried to jump the border fence there. What are conditions like there right now? What is the legal status of the people who are at the border?
Well, they're obviously in Mexico without documents. They breached the fence between Guatemala and Mexico, and they made the trek almost 2,000 miles up to Tijuana, and they thought they were going to do the same thing with the U.S.-Mexico border fence, and they couldn't, of course. They were met with tear gas and a strongly militarized border, and so these people are currently in a sports facility in Tijuana with a number in hand awaiting to be heard. Only a handful of them, 20, 30, 40, are being accepted by the United States for asylum. And that is behind the line of those that are already in Tijuana. Haitians and Africans and other Central Americans and South Americans, they're already in line. The United States has made it very clear that only a few at a time will be accepted. So these 5,000 to 6,000 people will have to get to the back of the line. It will take months, and the conditions under which they live are really squalid. So Mexico will have a very important thing in its hands right now, trying to coordinate with Washington. The key here, I think, is to understand that Mexico City and Washington are not going to see eye to eye on what to do with Central America. The new president in Mexico has made it clear that this is a development issue and that Washington and Mexico City have to sit down and figure out a way to develop Central America. Washington prefers to deal with it unilaterally with a border wall, the military at the border, and a heavily militarized law enforcement. And clearly that's an approach that has led us to where we are right now.
John, is this going to be a festering issue for a long time?
It is. I mean, it has been for decades, and it likely will remain so for decades, even if there is some type of a grand U.S.-Mexico economic development plan for Central America. It'll take years, if not decades, to fully implement and to bring the societies up to the kinds of standards where you don't have thousands and hundreds of thousands of people looking to flee criminality, poverty, and really complete desperation. In the meantime, you are going to have a massing of migrants on the U.S. border. The president is quite clear about this. They're not coming inside the United States. And whether he's able to strike a deal with President López Obrador about housing these individuals on the Mexican side of the border and allowing a few at a time coming in. But for President Trump, this is an existential issue if he intends to win re-election in 2020. And just the way he's very much focused on automobiles and tariffs that affect the Rust Belt states, Mexico, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Trade and immigration are his two cornerstone issues. He is not going to back down on either one, I think, in any serious way. So I think we're going to be dealing with this for quite some time to come. Very serious issue. And 83% of Republicans want a wall. 53% of swing voters want a wall. President Trump is looking at 2020 while all this is playing out.
I think that's absolutely right. This is going to be his issue for the 2020 presidential election campaign. He conceded on Twitter today that the case for the wall is in trouble on Capitol Hill. He said, I can't do it without the support of Democrats, which obviously he is never going to get. But this is a man who is willing to tell falsehood after falsehood about the role that immigrants play in American society in order to keep his base on side. The Associated Press analyzed one tweet that he put out over the last couple of days about what he claims are the costs of immigrants to American society, and could not find a single factual basis to support what he was saying about those costs. This coming at a time when the agricultural sector in California is saying, we don't have enough immigrants to pick the lettuce, to pick the apples. We're having to turn to high-tech solutions to it. That doesn't impact the fact that he is going to run on this issue solidly between now and 2020, and facts are going to take a backseat.
Eleanor, if President Trump runs on this issue on immigration, I mean, would he use the experience that he got from the midterms where immigration was not a big issue? It was healthcare that was the issue.
Well, that's right. But I think he's not going to abandon it. He believes he was elected on that issue. I think he thinks that they gained seats in the Senate because of that issue. And in his mind, this is his central reason for being president. So I think the Democrats in the House are probably going to make an attempt to pass some sort of patchwork immigration reform. It won't go anywhere, but the battle lines are clearly set for 2020. And the president may get some money for that wall. Actually, the federal government hasn't even spent the money they got in the last budget to build the wall. It's a symbol. It's a rhetorical symbol, really. And the president is going to continue hammering away at it as hard as he can.
All right, I'm going to get to our final issue, and that is the death of former President George H.W. Bush. Let's go to Zhao in Beijing. And Zhao, many in China credit former President H.W. Bush with laying the groundwork for current U.S.-China relations. In fact, the China Daily newspaper eulogized him as a, quote, statesman of vision. How is his death being seen in China?
Well, first of all, my condolences to the Bush family. I think President Bush is widely respected in China. He has played a critical role during his tenure as a director of liaison office in Beijing during the late 1970s. And then he played a critical role as a president during the turbulent years, 4 years before and after the end of the Cold War. So I think really this is not an underestimate to say that overestimate to say that President Bush has played a critical role in laying down the foundation of U.S.-China relations that has become today. And President Bush has good relations with the leader back then with China, and he has a deep understanding of the Chinese people. So I think he has been a model, an example for U.S. president to how to deal with China and how to establish relations with China. And we wish the current administration could learn the example from him. And also, we wish the Bush family can continue to play a role, a constructive role in terms of U.S.-China relations.
John, what do you think is George H.W. Bush's main legacy?
Undoubtedly, it's going to be the peaceful reunification of Germany in the context of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the end of the Soviet Union. Those three together, really unimaginable as recently, as the mid-1980s, the late 1980s. Almost nobody saw this coming. And in 1989, and a lot of this has to do with his character. He didn't gloat when the U.S. defeated the Soviet Union. There were many who wanted to do so, to make very clear that U.S. and Western values triumphed over Soviet totalitarianism. And he said, then we're going to have chaos and we're going to have war in Europe, and we all want to avoid that. And working with Mikhail Gorbachev brought about the end of the Soviet Union, the peaceful reunification of Europe and even of Germany over the objections of the British and of the French. I mean, we forget what a contentious 2 to 3 year period this was. So I think looking back, that is going to be his greatest legacy, and one that is still mind-boggling if you really take a step back and think about what the world was like from the 50s to the 80s.
Simon, foreign policy was his biggest legacy.
Yes, I mean, and that is coupled with the fact that domestically, faced with a stumbling economy, having said, read my lips, no new taxes, he then raised taxes, which ultimately cost him a second term in the White House in many regards, because the American public viewed him as being too focused on foreign policy and insufficiently focused on domestic affairs. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think as we were hearing from Beijing, you can't judge this in a vacuum. The timing of his passing, coming as it does at a moment when you have the antithesis of a statesman in the White House, means that I think in every regard his reputation is going to be burnished, and burnished by contrast with the man who's going to be attending his funeral but not eulogizing him at Washington's National Cathedral.
Well, Eleanor, you covered the George H.W. Bush presidency. What stood out for you?
Well, he spent 8 years as vice president, and he was really overshadowed by Ronald Reagan. And then his presidency was kind of quiet and mannerly, and the assembling of that coalition, the coalition of the willing, he actually got, I think, Saudi Arabia to pay some of the bills for the war. This was unheard of, but I don't think he ever got fully credit for it. His poll ratings went up to 90%. People liked the fact we won a war, but I don't think the skill it took to put all that together was fully appreciated. And of course, then the domestic economy wasn't working so well, and along came Bill Clinton, who could really relate to the American public in a way that George H.W. Bush couldn't. I mean, he was a Connecticut Yankee, moderate Republican, and we don't see any of them anymore. And I think the contrast is really felt this week. I think there's a kind of a yearning for his quiet leadership and his sense of grace and even his kind of goofy humor. There wasn't a mean bone in his body, and we have a different president today.
John, I mean, we see the coverage of his death in the United States media. It's sort of replete with hagiographies, but if we look at what Eleanor was talking about, his role in the war, there was one publication which said that this was the president who ordered Desert Storm, in which 88,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Iraq, killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, including hundreds at a civilian shelter, for which he refused to apologize.
Correct. I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at how that war played out, but first of all, let's keep in mind it probably never would have happened if not for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I mean, this was not simply something that took place in a vacuum. The Russians took a step back and allowed the U.S. to lead a major war coalition, including many former Soviet allies coming together in the coalition of the willing that Eleanor was talking about. He also did not go beyond the UN mandate. There were many who said after the complete rout of Iraqi forces that the U.S. should have taken this coalition, moved into Baghdad, and deposed Saddam Hussein, which they believe would have led to complete chaos and an occupation that would have been extraordinarily difficult to maintain, which unfortunately proved true 15 years later. So I think we also need to add one more description, back to your goofy humor comment, Eleanor, and that was George H.W.'s prudence. He talked about his prudence in all of his decision-making, and there's always going to be a debate about any type of major foreign policy issue, but I think on balance, I think he did the right thing on most of the critical issues that were put before him.
Did he have any personal flaws? Because there have been these allegations of sexual misconduct.
I can't give any of that any credence. We all have flaws. Okay. But I don't think it was anything at all that affected his governance or leadership style to speak of.
Tony, we've got just a couple of minutes left. What is your view on the passing of President H.W. Bush?
Well, a couple of things. Number one is he obviously was a great foreign policy leader for this country. He presided over a very important period in American history, the end of the Cold War, and everyone should give him credit for that, for managing that very well, very prudently, very adeptly. But I also think that he is a watershed in American history. He was the last president, I think, to enjoy a true domestic political consensus on the values of America and on the role of the United States in the world. We then had Bill Clinton, and then in 1994, the takeover of the Republicans, a very different brand of Republican in Congress, led by Newt Gingrich at that time. And then the consensus on what America should be and the role of America in the world began to break down, and we have ended up with somebody like Donald Trump now. So the Republican Party that he represented, both domestically, on that great consensus of American history in the 20th century. And of course, the role of the United States in the world is now a very different thing. And indeed, I agree that history will judge him well, especially in contrast with what the Republican Party has become today.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.